Today we're tackling something that, honestly, sounds maybe a bit mundane. Seam allowance.
Right. It sounds like the simplest thing in sewing.
Exactly. But talk to anyone deep in the garment industry, pattern makers, developers, factory folks, and you find it's this constant source of, well, complexity, technical questions, quality control issues.
Yeah,
It all seems to come back to this little hidden edge.
it really does. And that's our mission today, kind of. To unpack why this invisible bit of fabric is so critical. It's not just scrap. It's fundamental for sewing things right, making adjustments, getting a good finish.
So that's like a shortcut to understanding the technical side, pattern making, development.
Pretty much, if you get seam allowances, you get a big piece of the professional puzzle. It really dictates fit, quality, and how efficiently things get made.
Okay, let's start right at the beginning then. Level set for everyone. What exactly we're talking about when we say seam allowance?
Sure, so imagine two pieces of fabric you're going to sew together. The seam allowance is simply the area, the strip of fabric that sits between the raw cut edge of the material and the actual line where you're going to put your stitches.
Construction line.
Precisely, the construction line. And this allowance, this buffer zone, it doesn't belong to the part of the garment you actually see or wear in the end. It gets hidden inside.
Gotcha.
And an interesting point for maybe the more technical listeners in CAD systems, computer-aided design for patterns.
Yeah.
This allowance isn't just drawn on. It's often treated like a separate layer or maybe an edge property, which gives developers amazing control, really flexible.
Okay, that makes sense. It's the working margin, the safety net. But safety nets aren't all the same size, are they?
Wait,
What about those commercial patterns, the ones you buy in a store for home sewing? Is there a standard there?
there generally is, yeah. Especially for the big North American pattern companies, McCall's, Simplicity. Their standard, their default, is typically 5/8 of an inch, which works out to about 1.5 centimeters. That's the assumption built into most of those patterns.
1.5 centimeters.
Okay.
But I know that's not the whole story. Once you step outside that home sewing world, things change, right?
Oh, absolutely. Drastically sometimes. This is super important for anyone working professionally or using, say, indie patterns or European designs.
What do they use?
Often much narrower margins. You'll commonly see 1 centimeter, maybe even just 0.7 centimeter.
Wow, it's almost half. Why is it so much smaller?
It ties directly into manufacturing, mass production. Narrower allowances mean you use less fabric, which saves money, obviously.
Sure, makes sense.
And crucially, those narrow allowances are perfect if the garment's going to be sewn on an overlocker, or a serger, as some call it. Those machines stitch and finish the edge all in one go, and they work best with less material there. It drives costs down and speeds things up. Big time.
Okay, so you get a pattern, maybe a digital file or a paper one. How do you know for sure if that allowance is included or if you need to add it? Rule number 1. Always check the instructions. The pattern notes are your Bible. Don't just assume it's there.
Never assume. Some designs, particularly very minimalist ones or maybe some European styles, they come without seam allowances. The lines on the pattern are the actual stitching lines.
So you have to add your own margin.
You've had it yourself, yeah. And similarly, in digital pattern making, the core block or shape is often designed net without allowances. Then the allowances are added later in the software, kind of parametrically.
Meaning you can set different widths for different edges.
Exactly. You might want 1.5 centimeters on a side seam, but maybe only 1 centimeter on a neckline and perhaps 4 centimeters for a hem. The software handles applying those specific widths where needed.
All right, that makes production very precise. Which brings us to accuracy. I know product developers are almost obsessive about consistent margins. Why? What happens if my seam allowance wavers a bit, a couple of millimeters here or there? Does it really matter that much?
Oh, it matters hugely. That tiny little inconsistency, that can throw off the entire fit of the garment. It's actually a major cause of problems.
Like what kind of problems?
Well, pieces just won't line up properly when you go to sew them together. Think about matching notches or seams. If the allowances are off, things start to drift.
Okay, I can see that.
And it leads to inconsistent sizing. One medium might fit slightly differently from the next one off the line, or you get weird pulling or distortion in the final garment. For a factory, maintaining those accurate margins is absolutely vital for stability, for consistent quality. Any wobble equals problems.
So precision is non-negotiable. If you are adding it manually, say from one of those net patterns, what's the best way? And are there any clever tricks?
Well, the professional way involves good tools. A clear gridded ruler, a rotary cutter sometimes, or a good tracing wheel against a pattern curve.
Okay.
But a really neat low-tech hack, especially if you're just starting out, Take two pencils.
Oh, pencils.
Yeah, two standard pencils. Put a rubber band around them tightly near the tips. Adjust the spacing between the pencil points to match the seam allowance with, you need, say, 1.5 centimeter.
I see where you're going.
Then you just trace along the original seam line with one pencil, and the other pencil automatically draws a perfectly parallel line at the correct distance, your seam allowance line.
That's actually quite clever. Simple, but effective.
It really is. Of course, in industry, digital tools mostly bypass that now. You just tell the software, add 1 centimeter allowance to this edge, and boom, it's done. Parametrically, like we said.
Okay, so that's adding it. What about sewing it accurately, keeping that line straight when you're at the machine? What helps there?
Yeah, maintaining it during sewing is the other half of the battle. This is where machine attachments and guides are key.
Like special feet.
Exactly. You can get presser feet that have built-in edge guides. A 1/4-inch foot is really common for quilting, for example, or you might get a 1/2-inch one. They just run along the edge of the fabric.
Okay.
Another really useful tool is a magnetic seam guide. It's just a little metal block with a strong magnet. You stick it onto the metal needle plate of your machine at the distance you need, say 50/8 of an inch from the needle.
And the fabric edge just bumps up against it.
Yep, acts as a physical guide, super handy and adjustable. Tailors might also use chalk lines or specific rulers, but if you look at industrial sewing machines,
Yeah.
their needle plates often have lines etched right onto the metal at all the common global standard widths, 1/4-inch, 1/2-inch, 1 centimeter, 1.5 centimeters. It's built right in for speed and accuracy.
Okay, that makes total sense. Now, let's get into the really interesting part, for me anyway. Adapting the allowance. It's not always that standard 1.5 centimeter, is it? Fabric choice plays a huge role.
A massive role. The fabric type can totally dictate what allowance you need. It's one of the first things you consider.
So like for fabrics that fray really easily, linen, maybe chiffon.
Exactly those. Anything that unravels easily needs a wider margin, often 1.5 centimeters or even more. You need that extra fabric real estate to properly enclose or secure the raw edge with a good finish, like a French seam or binding, so it doesn't just fray away inside the garment.
Okay, wider for fray-prone fabrics. What about the opposite? Knits, stretchy stuff.
Generally narrower, knits don't fray in the same way woven fabrics do, and they're almost always sewn using overlockers or sergers.
Which trim the edge anyway.
Right. Those machines trim off the excess as they sew the seam, so you don't need and often don't want a wide allowance there. It just gets cut off. So narrower is better, more efficient.
And what about really heavy fabrics like thick denim or wool coating? Do you need a big allowance for strength?
Well, you often do use wider allowances for those heavier fabrics, but maybe not primarily for strength. It's more about managing bulk.
Wait, wider allowances help reduce bulk. That sounds
Yeah.
backwards.
I know it does sound counterintuitive, but think about it. If you have a really thick fabric and you sew a standard seam, you end up with multiple layers of that thick fabric stacked up right at the seam line.
Yeah, it creates a ridge.
A big, bulky ridge. But if you have a wider allowance, say 2 or 2.5 centimeters, you have more room to work with after sewing the seam.
How so?
You can then grade the seam allowances. That means trimming the different layers to different widths. So maybe one layer is trimmed down to 0.5 centimeters and next to 1 centimeter. It staggers the thickness. And critically, it allows you to press the seam open properly. Pressing is key with heavy fabrics. If the allowance is too narrow, you just can't press it flat effectively, and you can't grade it well. So the wider allowance actually leads to a flatter, less bulky, more comfortable seam in the end.
That is a brilliant insight. Adding more fabric to ultimately make the seam lie flatter. Wow, okay. Let's tackle curves. Armholes, necklines, maybe princess seams or hip curves. They're notorious for puckering or not lying smooth. How does seam allowance factor in there?
Curves need very careful handling. They're a classic place where the standard allowance often gets reduced.
Reduced. Why?
Because when you turn a curve right side out, especially an inward curve like a neckline, the seam allowance fabric on the inside needs to compress or spread. If there's too much fabric there, a wide allowance, it bunches up and causes puckers on the outside.
So you might drop from 1.5 centimeters down to...
Maybe down to 1 centimeter or even 0.7 centimeters, depending on the sharpness of the curve and the fabric. Less bulk makes the curve turn more smoothly.
And there are techniques too, right? Clipping.
Absolutely essential. On an inward curve, you need to clip little V shapes or snips into the seam allowance, almost up to the stitching line. This allows the fabric edge to spread open when you turn it. On an outward curve, you might notch out little triangles to reduce bulk.
And trimming or layering again.
Yes, trimming and grading are also vital on curves to reduce that thickness before you press it. If you skip these steps, adapting the width, Clipping, trimming your beautiful curve will end up looking distorted, puckered, or feeling tight. Guaranteed.
Okay, so allowances change for fabric, they change for curves. What if I change the pattern? Like if I adjust a dart, or make a sleeve wider, or reshape a neckline? Do we need to think about the allowances around that change?
You absolutely do. Anytime you make a structural change to a pattern piece, redrawing a line, changing a dart's length or position, grading between sizes, you must reassess and often redraw the seam allowances around that altered area.
Why? What happens if you don't?
The pieces simply won't fit together correctly anymore. If you change a dart angle but don't adjust the seam allowance on the connecting piece to match that new angle, the edges won't line up. It leads to major sewing errors and can completely distort the final shape of the garment. It's a common mistake when people start altering patterns.
Right, you have to true up the allowances.
Yeah.
Okay, this brings us neatly to the world of high-end tailoring. Couture, bespoke. I've heard they use really wide seam allowances, sometimes way more than the standard. Why is that?
That's right. In custom tailoring and couture, you'll often find allowances of maybe 1 inch or even up to 3 centimeters, sometimes more in specific areas.
3 centimeters. That's double the commercial standard. Is it just for insurance?
It's exactly that. It's garment insurance and adjustability built right in. Firstly, during the creation process, there are multiple fittings. That extra allowance gives the tailor room to make fine adjustments directly on the client.
Makes sense. Nipping and tucking.
Exactly. But even more importantly, it's about the future life of the garment. High-end pieces are investments meant to last for years, potentially decades.
And people's bodies change over time.
Precisely. That generous allowance, especially in places like side seams, center back seams, waistbands, means the garment can be let out or taken in significantly later on, accommodating changes in the owner's size or shape. Tailors deliberately build in that potential for future alteration. It's part of the value.
So that standard 1.5 centimeter allowance in ready-to-wear, it doesn't offer much room for later changes, does it?
Not really. It allows for maybe very minor tweaks, but not substantial alterations. It reflects a different expectation about the garment's lifespan and adjustability compared to couture.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've drafted, cut, sewn accurately, adapted the allowances. The garment is assembled. But the raw edge of that allowance is still inside. We need to finish it right.
Yeah.
Why is that step so important?
Finishing the seam allowance is crucial for both durability and aesthetics. Functionally, if you leave a raw edge, especially on a woven fabric prone to fraying, those threads will eventually work their way loose. Over time, with wear and washing, the seam itself could potentially unravel and fail.
So it protects the seam integrity.
Yes. And aesthetically, a well-finished seam just looks and feels better. It lies flatter, it's less likely to irritate the skin, and it signals a higher quality of construction. It prevents that messy, frayed look inside the garment.
Okay, let's talk methods. What are some of the common ways these edges are finished in the industry? I know there are technical terms and even codes.
There are. Probably the most ubiquitous finish today, especially in mass production and for anything stretchy, is overlocking or serging. It uses a special machine that loops threads around the raw edge while trimming it slightly. Fast and effective.
That's the standard zigzaggy looking finish you see inside most t-shirts.
Essentially, yes. Then you have more elegant, often more time-consuming methods, like French seams. You mentioned codes earlier. We might see this specified as C010 on a tech pack.
C010, what does that code ensure?
It ensures universality. A manufacturer in Vietnam sees 010 and knows exactly the steps required to create that specific seam finish, identical to how it would be done in Italy or Portugal. It's a global technical language.
And French seams are good for?
Perfect for lightweight or sheer fabrics. Silks, chiffons, organza, because the raw edge gets completely enclosed within the second line of stitching. It's a very clean, beautiful finish where you see no raw edges at all.
Okay, neat. What about sturdy stuff? Denim, workwear?
For reinforcement and durability, you often see things like welt seams, maybe coated C110. These are strong, often top-stitch seams, common in jeans and sturdy shirts. They handle stress well and minimize fraying.
Right, like the flat-filled seams on jeans.
Similar principle, yes. Then moving towards higher-end finishes again, you have bound seams. This involves wrapping the raw edge of the seam allowance with a separate strip of fabric. It gives a very clean, tidy edge, often seen inside unlined jackets or skirts. It looks very professional. The codes here might range from C101 to C105, and there are similar codes for bound hems like H101 to H105, depending on the exact method.
Wow, okay, so the finishing choice isn't just random. It's really tied to The fabric, the garment's purpose, the price point.
Absolutely. It's a strategic decision. Overlocking is fast and cheap for a basic tee. French or bound seams signal higher quality and are suited to delicate fabrics. Welt seams mean durability. The finish tells a story.
So, looking back at everything we've covered, seam allowance is far from simple. It's
Yeah.
it's a really complex and strategic part of the whole process.
It truly is. Getting the width right, keeping it consistent, adapting it for fabric and shape, and then finishing it properly, it directly impacts how the garment fits, how long it lasts, how good it looks, and how efficiently it can be produced. It's a hidden engine, like you said at the start.
So here's something to think about, connecting those dots. We heard that standard commercial garments usually give you that 1.5 centimeters, that 58ths of an inch.
Right, the common standard.
But we also heard that high-end custom tailoring insists on much more, maybe up to 3 centimeters, specifically to allow for future alterations and extend the garment's usable life.
Yeah, building in that longevity.
So if a typical ready-to-wear garment only gives you that bare minimum 1.5 centimeters to play with, what does that really say about how long the manufacturer expects you to keep it, or how much they expect your body to stay exactly the same? It implies something about planned obsolescence, maybe, or at least limited long-term adjustability.
That's a really provocative point. The allowance itself can be a clue to the garment's intended lifespan and value proposition.
Exactly. So next time you're looking at clothes, maybe trying something on, take a second, flip it inside out, look at those seam allowances. How wide are they? How are they finished? You might find a whole hidden story about quality and longevity stitched right into that invisible edge.